Hello humans! Today, I wanted to talk about Path of the Midnight Sun, a game that used to be a Fire Emblem ROM hack and was then turned into its own full indie game, and it's now live on Steam over the past about week to 10 days. In full disclosure, I've been talking to the developers for quite a while, and they did send me a free review copy of the game, but just like I do with all of my review type content, I'm going to be as honest and fair as possible, both for your sake and to give them some good feedback. This review is also pretty much completely spoiler free. I might make some allusions to things in the story section, but it will all be pretty indirect and you won't really understand what I'm talking about unless you've actually played the game. Anyways, without further ado, let's dive right into it. I'm going to kick it off by talking about the gameplay. Despite it being a Fire Emblem ROM hack previously, Path of the Midnight Sun has transitioned fully into a turn-based JRPG format in which you select your actions, and then you act based on your speed versus the speed of your allies or the enemies that you're fighting. It's a very straightforward and simple system, similar to the ones seen in traditional old-school RPGs like the original Dragon Quest games, for example. And throughout the main campaign, you walk around battle maps in a time-based system where walking from each square to the other takes a certain number of minutes, and your goal is to clear the objective within the time frame allotted to you. Certain terrain takes longer to traverse through, so you need to keep an eye out and potentially plan your moves ahead of time. Where this game deviates and is a little bit unique, however, is in the additional systems that it has on top of the basic combat. There is an extra element called adjutants, which are allies that you recruit throughout your journey, both as main story recruits as well as completing side or secret objectives, and you're able to select up to 4 of them to accompany you in battle. Each adjutant has both an active and a passive skill of sorts, so for example, one might reduce the damage taken by front row allies by 15%, but has an active skill with a 25% chance to proc to do an additional attack after all allies and enemies have completed their turns, and it can cause certain status effects and do damage. Another gameplay element that Path of the Midnight Sun has is skill trees. Each of your allies have 2 possible skill trees that you can put mana points into. This might not make sense as you watch the video, but for story purposes, I won't go deeper than that. If you play the game, it's very straightforward, but think of it as a post-battle skill point system that is one gigantic pool that can be spent on your party as you see fit. And basically, what you decide to do is you pick a side and you assign skill points into it and you pick certain skills over the other depending on how you want to play the game. It's pretty simple. Since this game is an RPG, we also can't forget the status effects and the buff and debuff system. In Path of the Midnight Sun, it's fairly straightforward. Buffs and debuffs can target any stat you have, like attack, defense, and speed, while status effects are those such as bleed, paralysis, frostbite, burn, blind, and panic. Most of these are fairly self-explanatory, so I won't really go into the details. It basically tells you what happens and you can figure them out on your own. The last part of the gameplay I want to talk about are the exploration sequences. I was torn between putting this here or in the story section, but I guess since it's a bit of both, but mostly active engagement, it kinda goes here. This game has somewhat of a visual novel component, with being able to build points towards character relationships and even gain certain stat boosts if you pick the right choices. I love to put in the fact that decisions matter, because it's the age-old meme for anyone in the Fire Emblem community, but I guess here it does. Although not to a hugely relevant extent, it's not going to drastically change the story or anything, at least as far as I'm concerned. I think there might be a bad ending for the story or something like that if you really screw up. But anyways, as part of the exploration, you get to walk through various towns, find items on the ground, do your shopping, talk to your allies in your encampment, forge items, and cook food, etc., etc. These sequences can be quite charming, actually. And there are definitely portions in the game where I fell in love with the level of detail and comedy that was added in, especially a certain sequence of events with a couch that we definitely don't want to be sitting on, and I'll leave it at that because it is downright hilarious and everyone should experience that blind. If, after all this summary, you don't expect me to be critical, that's where you're wrong, because on this channel we assert our opinions, so like, share, and subscribe, and comment letting me know what you think because I want to hear all of it. Path of the Midnight Sun shows a lot of promise in many of these gameplay areas, but in my opinion, it definitely could have been far better. Now, this is an indie game, and it is their first time producing a game, so you want to take it with a grain of salt. I think, for a first attempt, this was a fantastic game. It was a lot of fun to play. I genuinely enjoyed it from start to finish, but nothing is perfect. And the developers are still working very hard to continue to patch the game and take feedback, and in just the last week alone since release, there have been already a ton of balances, to combat and certain spells, as well as buffs to enemies based on the suggestions of the players, one of them being me. I was very open with the developer and I said, hey, I think this is too easy, or this is a problem, or this is broken, or whatever, and it was immediately fixed within the first week. So this commitment to improving the game genuinely establishes a lot of trust with a player base or a fan base, or even with someone like me who has to change the script in order to review the game because it was changed so quickly while I was writing this. But in terms of keeping this script sort of aligned with my experience, the combat after you unlock skill trees feels painlessly brain dead. I played on normal difficulty because that's what I usually do whenever I play a game for the first time, but I did have a friend that played on hardcore, and we cross-confirmed with each other that all you basically do is spam AoE spells and regular enemies are no problem. This completely trivializes any challenge of maps and the time-based system challenging you to finish on time. What also surprised me was that boss fights were rather simple and didn't really seem to have many gimmicks that made you change up the way you play the game. It was mostly attack, heal, and maybe try and debuff the boss, and you'll really have no issue surviving for the most part. I, again, can't really say how it is now after the changes, but I'd have liked to see more bosses put up a tougher fight, possibly have more creative mechanics like HP thresholds unlocking new skills, disabling some of your skills, maybe have them use a more intensive use of the status system, something like that. And because of the way the game pans out, skill tree investment just also becomes fairly obvious, where you would think you would like to pick one of two sides, which I was honestly kind of torn on when I initially unlocked the skill trees. You basically just invest into your AoEs and things that increase your raw power, and the rest of the stuff you can pretty much ignore, which is a little bit sad because, a unit like Ferritras, has her niche of being able to tank and dish out a lot of damage when she's hit. But if nothing's hitting her, then why would you even go down that route in the first place? Anyways, there are some interesting mechanics and thought put into both sides of the trees, but it's never really utilized properly due to the lack of difficulty in the game, like I just said. You kinda just kill before being killed and you're golden. Adjutants are also underutilized in more than one way, but I'll talk about them from a gameplay perspective now and save the story perspective for a little bit later. Given that most of the generic fights didn't last past turn 1 or 2, you rarely get to see adjutants activate unless it was in longer boss fights, and even then, the best ones to use are pretty obvious to the point that you'll almost never change them around in the second half of the game. I think I can count on one hand, or not even one hand, maybe two fingers, how many times an adjutant has come in clutch at a point where I really needed it in the game. They're just there for a little bit of bonus damage and weren't really doing much. I honestly am not entirely sure how I would fix this if I were part of the developers, but I'd probably opt for less broad effects and make them all quite more niche to have them balanced across the board. And then if certain boss fights had certain niches that were covered by these adjutants, that would at least give them a certain amount of use, at least in the chapter that they come in. Because it's a shame that even some of these adjutants, they show up in a chapter and you don't even want to use them because what you have is already really good. The last gameplay element I want to critique is actually my favorite one, and that's the exploration and side quests. After a certain point in the game, side quests just stop existing entirely. I don't know why this is. I think I have a hunch that it's probably due to story reasons with a very specific thing that happens in the second half of the game that is probably removing side quests. I know I'm talking very vaguely here, but that's just my prediction. But I would have expected them to find a way to at least keep them being around for the rest of the game in a specific way. Exploration never truly stops, but it seems like it tapers off in terms of the creativity of the writing during the sequences, up until it almost barely exists altogether in the last couple chapters. Early on in the game, there are multiple smaller areas within a big city or a town you're in. There's a lot of things going on, and towards the end, it's just a house or two with one main area for you to explore, maybe find a couple pieces of gold, and some of them get reused a few times from the early game, so it doesn't even feel like you're exploring anything new. It's just going back to old places that are pretty much the same. This was quite a shame, because the game was doing so well in the middle third with the exploration variety, the creative NPCs, the side quests were a little bit engaging, and to have all that just kind of fall off, it hurt my soul, man. It was a little bit disappointing, especially coming off that hilarious side quest with the couch. I wanted more of that, and I never got any of it. And since I was really enjoying it, it felt like the game sort of took it away from me, and it just wanted to shove story down my throat and beeline it for the last third, and it kind of forgot the charm of the first half of the game, because that's what really gave it a lot of life and was so attractive to me in the first place. Anyways, speaking of story, since I mentioned it, let's talk about that next. I think if you've been on this channel long enough, you know I'm a pretty big stickler when it comes to story and characters, and I find myself relatively easy to please, but fairly hard to impress. I'm going to say it straight up, I was actually impressed by Path of the Midnight Sun. There were a few things I didn't expect. It did a fantastic job with the story and the characters. Even though it starts off with a fairly basic amnesia plot that we see a lot in modern media, combined with a Demon King revival plot that we also see a lot in modern media. And for the sake of not spoiling things outright, I'll say that there are a couple of plot twists that happen that I definitely did not see coming. And if you can hit me with the good old uppercut when it comes to a plot twist, I'm gonna be a happy sailor. And they didn't do it once, they did it about 2 or 3 times. So where that was prevalent, that was fantastic. Most things do end up making sense in the second half of the game, but one of my problems is that it ends up hitting us with some story facts that are just kind of there. It's like it's listed out and you just need to accept it as a player, instead of having more reasoning woven into why certain things happened or how certain things occurred. Instead, it's just like, oh, this happened, and you don't really need to know exactly how or why, but it just did. And that is something that I definitely have a problem with. It is really, really hard to review the story details in total depth without spoiling things, so I'll just say that, once again, the first 2/3 of the game makes quite a lot of sense and is easy to follow, and has quite a lot of exciting reveals and lore, but the spiraling out of control that happens in the last segment does get a little bit tough to follow, and seem to be somewhat random at times, especially with some of the elements that I don't even think are entirely necessary to some of the plot. I did also say I was going to talk about adjutants in this segment, so I'll touch on them a little bit. A lot of these are supposed to be important characters that you meet along the way on your journey, and while I appreciate that it is very hard to properly integrate a large cast into an RPG, most of these characters end up as one-and-done instances and you'll never see or hear from them again outside of their respective chapters. It is a bit of a shame, since there are a lot that you'd expect to be recurring characters given their importance, but they really just step aside once their role is done for that chapter. It's a bit of a missed opportunity, and at times their inclusion almost feels entirely irrelevant, like a certain character in the desert area, for example, or, one of the ones that we find in the winter area. They feel like they're shoehorned in for the sake of just one little story beat, and then you never hear from them again. The last thing I'll touch on in this segment are the main cast of characters themselves. I think Path of the Midnight Sun did a pretty good job with its characters overall. I don't have too many complaints here, actually. The main character, Suzaku, has a very interesting story, and it's fully explained, while there are 2 other characters in the supporting cast that have quite the interesting development in terms of their involvement in the story. However, one thing I don't entirely like is how at some point, once again in the final third, the narrative of the story ends up completely overtaking the development of the characters themselves. For example, in the first few chapters, Faratros has a massive aversion to killing and seems to be teetering on the border of insanity because of it, with the game even visibly causing her to lose sanity points. That seems to eventually go out the window entirely, and we never really got a conclusion to that character arc, which is a shame, honestly. That's just one example, and I do have a couple of others, but again, for spoilers' sake, I won't mention them all. One other thing I'll say about the characters, though, is that since the focus is on a core of 3 or 4, there are unfortunately a couple of other characters that completely suffer in the development department. They end up getting 1 or 2 very story-relevant inclusions, but outside of that, they're comic relief and just a very classic case of side character syndrome, instead of feeling like a genuine part of the main cast. The lore of the story is fantastic, though, and I think all those reveals are what really sold me on the story in general. I just wish it would have been more tightly explained and handled in a way that I can completely support. Instead, it was just kind of thrust on us, and I'm left wanting just a little bit more here in terms of the thoroughness of it all. Anyways, time to transition over to the more artistic portion of this video and talk about the art, the music, and the voice acting. Honestly, I'm generally not too hard to please with art and music, in contrast to the story. Path of the Midnight Sun's general art direction is warm and cozy, and it feels nice to look at and navigate through in terms of both the gameplay maps and the exploration sequences. There are little chibis during the map sequences that are pretty nice. The characters themselves are nicely done, and there are even critical hit and skill cut-ins that happen during the combat sequences that give the game a bit of more oomph and it's a nice touch. I said the word nice too many times, but I mean, that's how you describe it. It's a cool feature. I do also like the character design itself, and I feel like everyone has a unique and very identifiable look that complements the character's personality and story. The music overall is rather nice, again with the word nice here. I think it's quite soothing mostly. It's not my type of music. I like more fast-paced things, and I don't think there are that many tracks that really popped out to me. I think there might have been one boss fight track that I was really jamming out to, but otherwise it was consistently pleasant. The game also does have a certain amount of voice acting in it, although it is limited and not fully voiced. I think there were only a few instances where I kind of thought that a voice didn't really match a character or that the tone might have been slightly off, but overall the game was well casted, directed, and executed in terms of voice acting. Artistically, I think the game is solid and don't really have any complaints, especially since this is an indie game and their budget is limited for these kind of things. Overall, I think Path of Midnight Sun was a nicely developed indie RPG and visual novel hybrid game. It had a lot of unique mechanics that were fairly well explored, as well as a bunch of very interesting story twists and plot points. The characters were mostly endearing and memorable, and the art style and music that accompanied it were appropriate and consistent. I hate saying that a game lacks something in my outro especially, but for the sake of being fair, I have to knock the game for being generally inconsistent in its execution, especially in the last portion of the game, where execution is most important, at least in my opinion. I feel like if the quality and polish that was put into the first 2/3 of the game was applied throughout the entirety of it, this game would be a much better final product. One thing I do like to state as well here is a comparison of price point and time expected to clear the game. Currently it's listed at $25, and the game took me around 16 hours to complete. Though with the rebalancing, I can see that being closer to around 20 hours potentially, especially for those not familiar with the genre. All in all, I think it was quite the pleasant experience to play, and I would recommend it to anyone with an interest in the genre or who wants to support an indie developer coming out of our community. I'm honestly very proud of the product that they developed and hope to see more improved games from them in the future. And if I'm going to have to put a final rating on this game, which I usually do like to do for my review videos, I'm going to say it probably a 7 out of 10. It's good, but again, I think given the fact that there's a lot of room for improvement, coupled with the inconsistencies and lack of capitalization on certain gameplay elements, it's hard for me to go very much higher than that. Anyways, let me know what you all think in the comments below, and I hope to see you all in a bunch more videos very soon. Fire Emblem Engage is coming out, I don't know when this video is coming out, but I think tomorrow or the day after, and we're going to go hard, so peace!